you are muted. Please make sure that you mute it, that we don't have a noise in the background. This meeting will be recorded, so if you do need a copy of it or a recording of it, let me know and I will forward it to you and you can send it to whoever you want to. In terms of questions, in the chat box as we go along, you can ask questions. And then once I've finished with my presentation, we will first answer all the questions in the chat box, and thereafter you're welcome to unmute yourself and then ask questions. And between myself and Trisha Delpat, we will try and answer your questions. Now, Trisha Delpat is a admitted attorney, conveyancer, notary, and notary, did I say that? And she's the head of our transfer department, and she will assist when it comes to the questions. All right, let's start with the presentation. Right, as I said, we're going to discuss installment sale agreements today. This presentation is recorded, and the appropriate, or the act that's relevant to installment sales agreements is the Alienation of Land Act. We refer to it also as the ALA. Alrighty, so in simple terms, what's the main aim and purpose of the Alienation of Land Act, or for the registration of installment sale agreement? It is to protect the purchaser. Now let's just think logic about this whole thing. If you sell a property to a potential or to a purchaser on an installment sale agreement, and let's take it that he doesn't take occupation of the property and it doesn't get registered in terms of the act, etc. There's nothing stopping the seller, if he's obviously dishonest, to sell the property again on an installment sale agreement to somebody else. The two purchasers won't know of each other, and the seller could just collect all the money and at the end just don't transfer the property, for instance. Another instance, if we just think logically about installment sale agreement, your seller might stop paying his bond. At the end of the installment sale agreement, once the purchaser has paid the full purchase price, there might still be a bond outstanding. And so you can think of a few scenarios and you can see the reason why there is laws in place to protect the purchaser when there's installment sale agreement. Right, so let's have a look. What are the essential elements of an installment sale agreement? In terms of the provisions of Chapter 2 of the Alienation of Land Act, it states that the land that you are selling or you're buying has to be, or the intended mainly for residential purposes. We'll discuss that now more in detail. The land must be sold for money. The installments must be more than 2 installments. And the price, or the installments must be over a period exceeding 1 year. Main intention must be residential purposes, used for residential purposes, sold for money, more than 2 installments exceeding 1 year. That's the basis of an installment sale agreement. Now let's have a look at the following. That part of where we say mainly for residential purposes, and that's where agricultural land comes in. Can agricultural land be sold in an installment sale agreement? Now, the position of agricultural holdings was always uncertain and should be assessed according to circumstances. The fact that land is registered as an agricultural holding does not mean that it is not intended to be used mainly for residential purposes. So people, the long and the short is, you can sell a property, a plot, agricultural holding in terms of the installment sale agreement, in terms of installment sale agreement, and protected by the Alienation of Land Act. Right, on condition that the property or the plot or the agricultural holding is mainly used for residential purposes. All right. Now we're looking at what the seller's duty is. You entered into an installment sale agreement. The purchaser has to be protected. Here we're going to look at what the seller's duty is. If there's a bond over the property and the seller sells it on an installment sale agreement, the seller has to, within 30 days after conclusion of the contract, hand to the purchaser a certificate drawn up by the bank, not older than 4 months by each bank if you have more than one bond over your property, which indicate the amount that the bank would need to settle the bond, as well as the interest of the rates, the interest rates that's applicable to the bond. The seller has the duty to give the purchaser a certificate from the bank within 30 days after conclusion of the contract, stating what the settlement amount must be or is, and the interest rate. Important. That way you are protecting the purchaser's rights. Now, what happens if the purchaser or the seller doesn't do that? Seller fails to furnish the purchaser with a mortgage certificate, or even if that certificate indicates that the bond is more than what the purchase price is. Then the purchaser entitled within 14 days after the 30-day period referred to in subsection 1 has expired to cancel the contract. I mean, that's huge. You can cancel the contract if you don't get that certificate, or if it's indicated that that purchase price is more, the bond, the settlement is more than the purchase price. We'll carry on, we'll explain to it now. He can carry on with the agreement if he wants to, but he's got that right to cancel the agreement. Okay. Now, section 7.4 forces a bank to give within 21 days after it's been requested by the seller to give such a certificate. And if you read that last sentence or the last 2 lines of the paragraph at the bottom, the bank shall be liable to such a person as if he were obliged by contract to furnish him with such certificate and failed to do so. That's the bank. So the bank is obliged, they have to give the seller such certificate within 21 days. So there's no excuse from the seller. Once a purchaser has signed and entered into installment sale agreement, the purchaser, to protect his own interest, has to inform the bank of the conclusion of that contract and his address. Okay, and if the bank asks for more detail, then he can do so. So the purchaser must inform the bank, the bank that's holding the bond, that the agreement that they've entered into and what his physical address is. Now, this is the important part, the last paragraph. If a purchaser has complied with the above condition, the bank shall at least 21 days before instituting legal proceedings against the seller inform the purchaser of his intention to do so. So if your purchaser has informed the bank that he is purchasing the property in terms of installment sale agreement, he knows that if the seller is not paying his bond and the bank is going to issue summons or take legal action, by law, the bank has to inform him of that. Disclosure of the release figures to the purchaser. We say any purchaser may, if the land and so and so. The point I wanted to make on this page is that last paragraph: a purchaser shall not be entitled to require from the bank more than 3 certificates per calendar year. In other words, the purchaser can ask the bank 3 times a year what is the outstanding amount, and the bank has to, by law, in terms of the Alienation of Land Act, has to inform him what the amount is. Jan, just admit Esther, please. All right. Now, another thing that's very important. The purchaser, if the seller fails to pay the bank, in other words, if the seller fails to fulfill his obligations to the bank, the purchaser may fulfill the obligations of that owner. In other words, the purchaser may pay the bank on behalf of the seller. Then have a look at section 11(1)(c). The owner is not entitled to recover from a purchaser any payment made in good faith by the purchaser on behalf of the owner to any mortgage bond, to the bank. In other words, the purchaser can pay the bank directly if the seller is not paying the bank, and the purchaser will know that from the certificate he gets from the bank. And then the owner can't claim that money back from the purchaser because he's paid it to the bank. Right, straightforward, simple. I've cut and pasted this directly from the Act, and you'll see it's a little bit confusing to understand, but I'll explain it now. Section 12 says, when interest is payable in terms of a contract, it shall be calculated not more often than monthly. So you can't calculate it for, let's say, every 5 or 10 days. It must be a minimum of 10 a month, and not less often than quarterly. In other words, can't be more than every 4 months. Okay, so anything from a month, but not more than every 4 months. The interest payable in terms of a contract shall be calculated on the outstanding balance of the purchase price, then owing in terms of the contract. So if you're 2-3 years into your contract and you ask for, find out what the interest is and what's outstanding, then it must be on the outstanding balance. Such interest shall not exceed the prescribed rate of interest. There's an act prescribing what interest you are allowed to charge. So you can't just go and be simple and charge 75% interest. There's a law protecting the purchaser from that. Penalty stipulation, the only important thing here is in installment sale agreement, according to section 2 of the Conventional Penalties Act, the seller must choose between either payment of a penalty or a claim for damages from the purchaser. You know, if the purchaser breach and the agreement doesn't go and the agreement gets cancelled, you can either claim penalties or damages. You can't claim both from the purchaser. Now, we've discussed it that the seller has to give the purchaser 30 days after the conclusion, or within 30 days after conclusion of the agreement, that certificate from the bank. If he doesn't do that and the purchaser gives him 14 days to comply with that, and if he doesn't do that, we've seen earlier on, he can cancel the agreement. But then if he chooses to carry on with it, look at the paragraph on the right-hand side that's underlined. The purchaser will then not be liable for the payment of interest in terms of the contract from the date of the conclusion of the sale, upon which the purchaser receives, until that day that the purchaser receives a copy of the contract from the seller. Sorry, I'm confused. I'm talking about I referred to the certificate. I'm actually talking about the actual agreement. So if the seller doesn't give the purchaser a copy of the agreement within 30 days after the contract, and he requested after the 30 days, and he gives the seller 14 days to give him a copy of the agreement, and he doesn't do that, then the purchaser is not liable for payment of interest from the time that the agreement has been signed until he gets a copy of the agreement. That's why it's so important to know all these things, and when you enter or when you assist clients with installment sale agreements, that you really know what this is all about. Certain things are invalid in agreement, and that's in the Act, section 15. I'm going to read it. It makes more sense if I read it. There are certain provisions that are invalid if they appear in a contract. An agreement whereby a purchaser forfeits any claim in respect of necessary expenditure the purchaser has incurred in regard to the maintenance of the land or improvements thereof. So you can't exclude it. You can't say, Mr. Purchaser, you can't claim it. The law protects, the Act protects the purchaser. Any improvement which enhances the market value of the land and was affected by him on the land with the express or implied consent from of the said seller. It carries on. An agreement whereby the liability of a seller to indemnify the purchase against eviction is restricted or excluded. In other words, if the purchaser puts in the agreement, Mr. Seller, you have to indemnify me that if there's an eviction order against you, that I will be indemnified and I will be able to stay in the property. Unfortunately, such a condition will not be valid in an agreement. The logic of it is, if you've got something like that, the purchaser occupies the property, the seller doesn't pay his bond, then the bank can't evict that person. They can't throw him out. So that you can't have that in your agreement. Second paragraph, an agreement whereby a purchaser is obligated to accept a loan secured by a mortgage bond arranged on his behalf by the seller or his agent for payment of all the amounts owed to him. In other words, you can't say in an agreement, Mr. Purchaser, if I, the seller, arrange for a bond for you, then you have to accept the bond and have it registered and transfer the property into your name. You can't do that. The purchaser doesn't have to accept it. That's the purpose of an installment sale agreement, that you don't take out a bond. Paragraph 3 on this page, an agreement whereby a purchaser, if he elects to accelerate the discharge of his obligation in terms of this contract, may not claim that the transfer of the land shall be effected against payment of all the amounts owing in terms of the contract. In other words, you can't have in an agreement to say that the installment sale agreements over a period of 5 years, but if the purchaser pays off the purchase price within 2 years, then I can't take transfer. Can't do it. Once a purchaser has paid the full purchase price, he is entitled to take transfer, be it after year, 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years. Okay. Statement of accounts, the seller has to, and free of charge, give a statement of account to the purchaser every 12 months. You can just think the logic behind it is to make sure and protect the purchaser that the seller is up to date with paying his bond, what is still outstanding, what is the settlement figure, what does the purchase still owes, and if he pays everything, will the bond be settled as well. So every 12 months, the seller has to give this certificate or statement to the purchaser. The purchaser has got certain rights. He can accelerate payments and claim transfer. So the purchaser has, during this installment sale agreement, he can make payment whenever he wants to, and no, not any time he wants to, but he can make early payments before the agreed time. He can make bigger payments, larger payments, and once he's paid everything or tender payment of all the amounts owing, he can insist that the seller give transfer to him. All right. If the purchaser breached the agreement, the seller can only give him notice or cancel the agreement or enforce certain provisions on condition that he's given the purchaser 30 days to rectify his breach. Now, in a standard sales agreement, it's normally 7 or 14 days. But by law, in terms of Section 19 of the Alienation of Land Act, the seller has to give the purchaser 30 days to rectify the breach. In that letter, he has to give a description, the alleged breach. He has to give a description, the seller. He has to demand from the purchaser to rectify the breach within 30 days, and also indicate the steps that the seller intends to take if the alleged breach is of the contract is not rectified. Okay. When a seller gives the purchaser 30 days notice during a calendar year, and the purchaser rectifies that breach, then if he defaults again or he's in breach again, the seller has to give him, in that same calendar year, another 30 days, to rectify the breach. If he does that and he fixes it and he rectifies it, and a third time within the same calendar year, he breached the agreement again, then the seller only has to give the purchaser 7 days. So 30 days, the purchaser rectifies the breach. Another breach, another 30 days, purchaser rectifies the breach. And a third time in the same calendar year, the purchaser breach again, then the seller only have to give the purchaser 7 days to rectify the breach. Okay, that's by law, people. Recording of a contract, it's simple, straightforward. The contract has to be recorded against the title deed in the deeds office. We're going to look now at whose duty it is, and if the one person, the one party to the agreement doesn't do it, what's the rights of the other party? Right. Recording of a contract, just for interest sake, you know, we're talking about land, and which is mainly used for residential purposes. You can also register a right of an exclusive use area. In other words, you want to buy a sectional title unit, and there's an exclusive use area that can be included in the contract in terms of the installment sale agreement. Just for interest sake, the recording in terms of section 20 of the contract is not allowed in respect of a real right of extension in terms of the Sectional Title Act. That's not really important for today's discussion. Have a look at the last paragraph. A contract may be recorded against the residential property which has been attached. Now, attached means that, let's say, the bank has issued summons against the seller for not paying, and they've attached the property, and they're going to sell it in the auction. So a contract may be recorded against the residential property which has been attached, provided the purchaser in writing confirms knowledge of the attachment. Now, you'd be silly if you're a purchaser entering into an installment sale agreement if you know that the property is attached. I don't think that really happens in the real world. So, who must bring the application to the deeds office to have the agreement recorded? The answer is the seller. The seller has to do it. He's supposed to do it within 90 days after the conclusion of the agreement. It's simple and straightforward as that. The purchaser shall be entitled to certain remedies if the seller fails to register the installment sale agreement against the title deed in the deeds office. Before I get to that point, and often we see it, remember that transfer duty is payable within 6 months after signing a conclusion of an agreement. All right, 6 months after the conclusion of agreement. If it's installment sale agreement or a normal agreements that you guys deal with every day, has to be paid within 6 months. If not, there are penalties. So installment sale agreement, same. The purchaser has to pay the transfer duty within 6 months after conclusion of the agreement. So let's have a look. What happens if the seller fails to register the agreement against the title in the deeds office? The purchaser can then register against the title deed of the seller. All right. The purchaser, if you look at on the left-hand side, the purchaser has no authority to apply to have the recording of the contract prior to the lapsing of the 90 days. After the 90 days, the purchaser may do it if the seller hasn't done that. If the seller, on the right-hand side, the seller fails to record the contract within 90 days from the date aforesaid, the seller may do that. The seller may also cancel the contract within 14 days after the 90-day period. So it's so important that as an agent and seller and purchaser, you have to make sure that you comply with all these things. Otherwise, purchasers can actually cancel the agreement and walk away. That's a way to get out if they really want to. when the bank, when the seller has a bond registered over the property, and an installment sale agreement is then registered against that title deed, the registrar concerned may register a mortgage bond over land in respect of which a contract has been recorded. Okay, sorry. I started off with if there's a bond before the registration of the agreement. So in this instance, it's such an instance, the ranking clause of such a bond must indicate that the said bond ranks after the contract. Sorry, I was confused there again. In other words, there's an installment sale agreement registered against the property against the title deed in the deeds office. Now the seller wants to register a further bond. He can do so, but then the bank must understand that the ranking clause of such a bond will be, or the ranking of that bond will be after the contract. In other words, it means if something goes wrong and the property is sold on execution at an auction, for instance, then the purchaser will first get his money, and then the bank will stand second in the queue to get his money back. Okay. Now, I can't imagine that the bank will give you a bond if he's aware of the fact that there's an installment sale agreement registered. Now, the second paragraph, just interesting to know this. If the bank in whose favor a mortgage bond over the land concerned is registered after such recording, in other words, after the installment sale agreement has been recorded, it is, however, then deemed to have consented irrevocably and unconditionally to the discharge of the mortgage bond or the release of the land from the mortgage bond if the purchaser should demand transfer. To explain it, the installment sale agreement is registered, the bank registered bond afterwards. Now the purchaser pays the bond, the seller the full amount. You don't even have to ask the bank for their consent to cancel their bond. It is deemed to have consented. The bank is deemed to have consented to the transfer. The registrar concerned shall not, that's the deeds office, shall not register a transfer of land in respect of which a contract has been recorded unless the transferee is the purchaser under the contract. Such recording has to be, or such recording has to be cancelled. So once, that's why it's so important. Once a recording, installment sale agreement has been registered against the title and deeds office, the registrar cannot transfer that property in somebody else's name other than the purchaser, or that installment sale agreement has to be cancelled. Important, the purchaser has a preferent claim in respect of the proceeds of the sale if the land that he's buying is sold in execution, or if the seller goes insolvent. He will have a preferent claim. He will be first in line to get his money back if it's sold in execution, or if the seller goes insolvent. Note, the purchaser's preferent claim ranks in preference immediately after any claim of a bank whose mortgage bond over the land was registered prior to or on date of the recording of the contract. So if there's a bond and you register your installment sale agreement after the bond is registered, you will stand as the purchaser, you will stand second in line. Okay. Yeah, if a title is endorsed in terms of section 20 and the owner is declared insolvent, or the land is attached and such land is transferred to a person other than the purchaser, the contract must first be cancelled. Now, I can only imagine that can create havoc if your purchaser refuses to agree to the cancellation. Be that as it may, at the death of the owner, what happens then? If the registered owner of land against which a contract has been recorded dies, the land may not be transferred to the heirs subject to the contract. In other words, you can't transfer it to heirs and keep the contract in place as it may only be transferred to the purchaser as indicated in the contract that has been recorded. So what's the solution? Either the estate will have to be kept open. You can't finalize the winding up the estate until the last installment has been paid, or the recording of the contract has been cancelled. So in a case like that, I would assume that another way is to cancel the installment sale agreement and enter into a new installment sale agreement with the heirs, if the purchaser so wish to do that. National Credit Act, people, yeah, that's a difficult one. Note that a contract as defined in the Alienation of Land Act may constitute a credit agreement as contemplated in the National Credit Act. To the extent that there is any conflict between Chapter 2 of the ALA and the National Credit Act, the National Credit Act shall enjoy precedence as from the 1st of June. Long and the short is, if there is interest payable, then the National Credit Act will kick in, and that means your seller has to be registered in terms of the National Credit Act. Not a nice one. Remember, even if the purchase price was R1, it used to be, I think, 100,000, 250,000, 500,000. That's now changed. It's now every single agreement where there's interest applicable the seller has to be registered with the National Credit Act. Our company is registered with the National Credit Act because we advance money to sellers. It's just an application. They ask lots of questions. You can give it to them. So it's not impossible to register with the National Credit Act. It can be done. All right, people. Now, I don't think one should enter into a installment sale agreement if you don't have a amortization calculator. I practiced that word so many times before this presentation, I still got it wrong. A amortization calculator. In simple terms, it gives you exactly, every time you pay X amount, it gives you like on a spreadsheet, what is still owed, how much of that is interest, and how much of that is capital. It makes it so much simpler, because can you imagine after 2 or 3 years of paying ABC every month, what arguments there will be in terms of what does this purchaser owes the seller, what's the outstanding interest rates, and so forth. Now, I looked at a spreadsheet or such a calculator, and I found one on the Uber calculator, amortization calculator. There's the website where you can find it. A friend of mine, his wife, prepared a spreadsheet with all these, with a amortization calculator. They sent me that. It's a spreadsheet. I can't vouch if it's perfect, but if you want that spreadsheet or a copy of that, you're welcome to send it to me at my email address is Jan L Jordaan, or send it to my WhatsApp and just request a copy and with your email address, and I will gladly email it to you. Questions, people? Thank you. Let's have a look at the chat box, see if there are any questions. Let's see quickly. I want to see morning all from Ursula. Everybody's just greeting. Morning. Is there a limit to the period in how long installment sale can be? Yes, Jade, it's 5 years. Okay, so it must be more than 1 year and limited to 5 years. What if the buyer wants to build new development instead of own residence? Sindiswa, I'm not too sure what you're asking. Trisha, can you help there?
She needs to be a bit more specific in her question.
Yeah.
New development, what is it? Building from scratch or
Yeah. Let's move it on.
property? Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we need some.
Sandisha, when we open the floor for questions, then you can just unmute yourself and then ask that question again, and let's see if we can answer. Can the bank that holds the bond refuse installment sale agreement? No, you can't. Obviously, they will make sure that their rights are protected. Rina, you mentioned that you cannot force buyer to accept bond approval. Would that also be on normal sales? No, Rina. Remember, that point is during that 5 years, if the seller arranged a bond for the purchaser, let's say after 3 years, and he can't then force the purchaser to accept that bond and then start paying off the bond instead of the seller. So it doesn't comply to a normal sale. Rina, I'm more interested in if it's legal to have this in a normal contract to force purchase to accept the bond. That's another topic. Obviously, you can't force a purchaser to enter into a bond agreement if it's not in his favor. I mean, if the bank comes back, let's take a silly example and say, I'll give you a bond on the condition that you must pay 20%. Surely you can't force a purchaser to accept that bond. Jay, does the bank that holds the bond have the right to assess the purchaser's affordability? No, it's got nothing to do with the bank. The bank's agreement is with the seller, and it's got nothing to do with the purchaser. Ursula, does the seller need to register with the Debt Collectors Association, or he is receiving installments? I'm sure you're referring to the National Credit Act. Yes, unfortunately, the answer is yes, if you're referring to the National Credit Act. Sandiswa, building property to rent or sell to the public. That's what I mean with new developments instead of building his own home. Okay, so in other words, the purchaser is buying the property and you're asking if he then develops it. The question is it mainly used for residential purpose or if it's a business? I can't tell you exactly what the answer is. I'm not too sure, but my gut feel is that you won't be, because it's not mainly intended for residential purposes. All right, so Ursula, yes, I've answered your question there. All right, people, if you have any other questions, just unmute yourself and then ask the question, and Trisha and I will try our best to answer it. Any questions? If there are no questions.
Jan, yes, sorry, I'm online. So talking about the National Credit Act, what is the process and how would a seller go about registering with the Debt Collectors Association? Would the attorney appointed by the seller to handle this contract, would they get involved and assist the seller?
Ursula, we've never done that, and I don't think we will, because it's quite involved. Charlene, are you on the Charlene? If you can unmute yourself and just quickly explain to Ursula when you did it on behalf of us, how involved was it? I see Jean just got up quickly, calling Charlene. Is she coming, Charlene?
Jan, I've got a registration process that I can email to Ursula, but in essence, the seller has to do the application. No third party can get involved, because it does pull for a criminal record clearance and all kinds of things. But yes, I'll definitely email Ursula the registration process and how to go about it with websites that can be accessed.
So if anybody else wants such an application form, just let us know on WhatsApp me. You should all have my number. WhatsApp me and with your email address, and we'll send that to you.
Trisha, if I could maybe just ask you, do you have an idea of the cost involved, and is this a yearly fee?
And if Charlene,
Charlene's back.
Yeah, Charlene, just unmute yourself quickly, please. Jean is still there.
All right.
Charlene,
Hello.
thank you. The question from Ursula is, how involved is it to register with the National Credit Act? Remember, you did it on our behalf. And
Should ask you quite
just a moment. What are the fees that we have to pay every year, or whatever the situation is, please?
Okay, Ursula, so the fee is about 1,200 Rand a year. And it is quite involved to register, but I mean, it's possible. It's not impossible. It is possible to register.
So could there be an instance? Could there be an
Yes.
instance where the seller doesn't qualify to register as a debt collector?
Oh, I wouldn't know.
I
Yes,
don't know.
yeah.
We were successful, Ursula, so we don't know.
No, I don't know. But Ursula, there is a whole lot of things that you need to fill in every 6 months. It just depends on your, if you're a business, if you're a private person, so it just depends.
But I think if we get that application form that Tricia is talking about, I think you would be able to see from that if it is possible, you know, would you qualify or not.
I believe, Jan, that a lot of people are anti the installment sale because of the debt collector process. Most sellers are in a position, they're urgent to sell. The buyer can take occupation. The buyer can pay the monthly installment to cover the bond. In the meantime, get the seller out of trouble. And the seller's sort of happy to wait a year to 5 years to obviously give transfer. But it's the onus on the seller to go through this whole process becomes quite difficult. So agents back off and don't even look at this kind of process.
It is, you know, if you can enter into an installment sale agreement, Tricia, help me out here. You can enter into an installment sale agreement and then not registered against the title deed. But from the presentation, you can see how the seller can abuse this whole thing, and the purchaser needs to be protected. So you would actually be silly not to have it registered against the title deed.
Makes sense. And a last question for me, guys.
Sorry, Ursula. Remember, even if you enter into an installment sale agreement, the fact that it's registered or not registered in the deeds office doesn't mean that the seller doesn't have to be registered with the National Credit Act. That's irrelevant. If it's installment sale agreement, the seller still has to be registered with the National Credit Act.
Okay. And a last question from your perception on agents' commission. Looking at a 12-month to a 5-year process, what is the norm, and how do the agents get their commission? Do they get it up front? Do they also get it paid off over a certain time? What is the norm on an installment sale agreement for agents' commission?
I haven't really picked up a norm. I'll give you my opinion, but before I give that, I always advise people, if they want to enter into an installment sale agreement, make sure that your purchaser can pay a big deposit. You know, if you commit it, if you're buying a property for R1 million, argument's sake, and you put down 100, 200,000 Rand, and you know there's a chance for you to lose it, you're going to make sure that you comply with the conditions. The commission, I don't know, Sheila, there's, as I said, there's not really a norm that I've picked up. It's obviously you've done your work the moment you sign the installment sale agreement. So a lot of agents ask for their commission from the deposit. You might argue that once the agent's taken his commission, you won't be interested to assist when there are problems. I know a seller would insist that the commission only, or part of it only, be paid at the end. So there's not really a norm, but I think it's something that has to be negotiated.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Thanks, guys. It was interesting.
Thanks, Ursula. Any other questions? All right, thank you people for attending. I think that's the end of our meeting then. If you're interested in a copy of the recording, just send me a WhatsApp. All that monetization calendar or spreadsheet, let me know and I can forward to you.
Thank you so much, Jan.
Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Bye.